I had been officiating weddings for over 20 years at St. Michael's Church in downtown Chicago, and I thought I had seen everything. The nervous grooms, the crying mothers, the occasional runaway bride. But nothing could prepare me for what I witnessed on that crisp October morning. The autumn leaves were painting the church grounds in brilliant shades of gold and crimson as I prepared for what was supposed to be the wedding of the year. Rebecca Martinez, daughter of one of Chicago's most prominent business families, was marrying Thomas Wilson, a successful tech entrepreneur. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's elite, and the church was decorated with white orchids and baby's breath that must have cost more than most people's monthly salary. I remember checking my watch 10:47 a.m. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 11 o'clock sharp, and everything was running like clockwork. The string quartet was tuning their instruments in the corner, filling the sacred space with soft, melodic notes. Guests were still filing in, their designer shoes clicking against the marble floors as they whispered amongst themselves, admiring the lavish decorations. Rebecca looked absolutely radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown. I had spoken with her during rehearsal the night before, and she seemed genuinely happy, her dark eyes sparkling with excitement as she talked about her future with Thomas. They had met at Northwestern University 3 years ago. She told me, both studying business. It was one of those fairy tale romances that everyone dreams about, or so it seemed. Thomas, on the other hand, had been noticeably more reserved during the rehearsal. He was a tall, lean man with sandy brown hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to analyze everything around him. When I asked him the standard questions about his commitment to marriage, he answered appropriately, but there was something in his demeanor that I couldn't quite place. A distance, perhaps, or maybe just pre-wedding jitters. After 2 decades of performing these ceremonies, I had learned to read people pretty well, but Thomas remained somewhat of an enigma. The groomsmen were gathered near the altar, straightening their ties and making last-minute jokes to calm their nerves. I recognized most of them from the rehearsal, college friends, business associates. Thomas's younger brother, Michael. They all seemed genuinely happy for the couple, though I noticed they kept glancing toward the door that led to the groom's preparation room. As I made my final preparations at the altar, adjusting my vestments and reviewing my notes one last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a subtle tension in the air that seemed to permeate the otherwise joyous atmosphere. The photographer was busy capturing every detail, her camera clicking rapidly as she moved the pews like a graceful dancer. The wedding planner, a stern-looking woman named Patricia, was barking orders into her headset, ensuring that every element of the ceremony would unfold perfectly. Even the flower girl, Rebecca's 6-year-old niece, was practicing her walk down the aisle, scattering rose petals with the seriousness of a professional performer. At 10:52, I took my position at the altar and signaled for musicians to begin the processional music. The guests rose to their feet, turning expectantly toward the back of the church. This was always my favorite moment, that hushed anticipation before the bride makes her grand entrance, when love and hope fill the air like incense. But as I stood there, hands folded, preparing to begin the ceremony that would unite Rebecca and Thomas in holy matrimony, I had no idea that within minutes, everything would change. The perfect wedding day was about to become something entirely different, and I would find myself at the center of a drama that would shake not only this congregation, but my own faith in what I thought I knew about human nature. The music swelled, and I prepared to welcome the bride and groom into their new life together, completely unaware that I was about to witness something that would haunt me for years to come. The processional music filled every corner of St. Michael's as Rebecca's bridesmaids began their elegant walk down the aisle. Each woman was draped in deep burgundy silk, carrying bouquets of white roses that complemented the church's autumn decorations perfectly. I watched from my position at the altar, noting how the morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the faces of the guests. Rebecca's maid of honor, her college roommate Lisa, was the last to walk before the bride herself. She moved with practiced grace, her smile genuine as she took her place opposite the groomsmen. The photographer captured every moment, and I could see tears already forming in the eyes of Rebecca's mother, who sat in the front pew wearing an elegant navy dress and a proud smile. At 10:58, I gave a signal for everyone to stand for the bride's entrance. The traditional wedding march began, and all heads turned toward the back of the church. This was a moment everyone had been waiting for Rebecca's grand entrance in what was undoubtedly the most important day of her young life. But as the music played and the congregation waited, I found myself glancing toward the side door near the altar, the one that led to the small preparation room where Thomas should have been making his final preparations. Something caught my eye, a movement in my peripheral vision that made me turn slightly. That's when I saw her. A woman I didn't recognize was emerging from Thomas's preparation room, and she was clearly trying to be discreet about it. She was perhaps in her late 20s, with shoulder-length auburn hair, and wearing a simple black dress that suggested she wasn't one of the wedding guests. What struck me most was her expression. She looked flustered, almost panicked, as she quickly smoothed down her hair and adjusted her clothing. I felt my breath catch in my throat. In 20 years of officiating weddings, I had developed an instinct for reading situations, and everything about this woman's behavior screamed that something was very wrong. She wasn't supposed to be there, and she certainly wasn't supposed to be coming out of the groom's room looking like someone who had been engaged in activities that had nothing to do with wedding preparations. The woman, I would later learn her name was Amanda, quickly glanced around to see if anyone had noticed her emergence from the room. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw a flash of panic cross her features. She had realized that I, standing at the altar with a clear view of that door, had witnessed her exit. But the wedding march was still playing, and Rebecca was now visible at the back of the church, radiant in her flowing gown, her arm linked with her father's as they prepared to walk down the aisle. The entire congregation was focused on this beautiful moment, completely unaware of the drama that was unfolding just steps away from where I stood. I felt frozen, caught between my duty to proceed with the ceremony and my growing realization that I was witnessing something that would change everything for Rebecca and her family. My hands, which had been folded calmly in front of me, began to tremble slightly. The words of the ceremony, which I had spoken hundreds of times, suddenly felt foreign on my tongue. Amanda, meanwhile, was attempting to slip away unnoticed. She moved along the side wall of the church, staying in the shadows cast by the large stone pillars. But her movements were hurried and suspicious, and I wasn't the only one who had begun to notice her presence. I saw Thomas's brother Michael glance in her direction with a confused expression, as if he recognized her, but couldn't quite place why she would be there. The bride and her father were now halfway down the aisle, moving slowly and ceremoniously as tradition dictated. Rebecca's smile was radiant, her eyes fixed on what should have been her future husband waiting at the altar. But where was Thomas? I suddenly realized that in all the chaos of watching Amanda's suspicious exit, I hadn't seen the groom emerge from his preparation room. My heart began to pound as the implications of what I was witnessing started to sink in. This wasn't just a case of pre-wedding nerves or a minor disruption. This was something much more serious. Something that could destroy not only Rebecca's wedding day, but potentially her entire future. As Rebecca drew closer to the altar, her face glowing with happiness and anticipation, I found myself facing the most difficult moral dilemma of my career. Should I proceed with the ceremony as planned, hoping that whatever I had witnessed was somehow innocent? Or should I find a way to stop everything before Rebecca's life was irreparably damaged? The music continued to play. The congregation remained standing in respectful attention, and Rebecca took her final steps toward what she believed would be the beginning of her happily ever after. But I knew, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that nothing would ever be the same again. Rebecca reached the altar looking absolutely breathtaking, her face glowing with joy as her father placed her hand in mine for the traditional blessing before passing her to Thomas. But that's when I realized the gravity of a situation. Thomas still hadn't emerged from the preparation room. "Where is he?" Rebecca whispered to me, her voice barely audible over the lingering notes of the wedding march. Her smile faltered slightly as she glanced around, expecting to see her groom waiting for her at the altar. I felt my mouth go dry. The congregation was beginning to murmur quietly, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Michael, Thomas's brother and best man, stepped forward with a concerned expression. "I'll go check on him," Michael said quietly, but I caught his arm gently. "Wait," I whispered, my mind racing. I needed to figure out how to handle the situation without creating a scene that would humiliate Rebecca in front of 200 guests. including Chicago's social elite. But I also couldn't ignore what I had witnessed. Just then, Thomas finally appeared from the preparation room. But his appearance told a story that matched my worst fears. His hair was disheveled, his tie slightly askew, and there was a guilty flush to his face that I recognized from years of counseling parishioners through their confessions. He looked like a man who had just been caught in a compromising situation. Sorry, Thomas mumbled as he hurried to take his place beside Rebecca. Just had to take care of something. Rebecca's smile returned, though I could see confusion in her eyes. She was trying to process why her groom looked so flustered and why it kept her waiting at the altar on what should have been the most important day of their lives. As I began the opening words of the ceremony, my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. But my mind kept flashing back to the image of Amanda slipping out of that room, her disheveled appearance, her panicked expression when she realized I had seen her. I had to make a decision. I could continue with the ceremony, marry these two people, and hope that whatever I had witnessed was somehow innocent, though everything in my experience told me otherwise. Or I could find a way to pause the proceedings and investigate further. During the reading of the scripture, I noticed Amanda had positioned herself near the back of the church, partially hidden behind one of the stone pillars. She was watching the ceremony with an expression I could only describe as tortured. This wasn't the face of someone who had innocently helped the groom with a last-minute problem. This was the face of someone carrying a terrible secret. As we moved through the traditional vows, I watched Rebecca pour her heart out to Thomas, promising to love him faithfully for the rest of her life. Her voice was strong and clear, filled with genuine emotion as she spoke about their future together. Thomas's responses, however, seemed hollow and rehearsed. He couldn't quite meet her eyes, and I noticed his hands were trembling as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was during my homily about the sacred nature of marriage, about trust and fidelity being the foundation of any lasting union, that I caught Thomas glancing toward the back of the church where Amanda stood hidden. The look that passed between them, brief but unmistakable, told me everything I needed to know. I paused mid-sentence, the weight of the situation suddenly overwhelming me. Here I was, speaking about the sanctity of marriage to a bride who had no idea her groom had likely been unfaithful with another woman just minutes before their ceremony. The hypocrisy of it all made me feel physically ill. Rebecca noticed my hesitation. "Father Rodriguez?" she asked quietly, using the name I had asked her not to mention. "Is everything all right?" The irony wasn't lost on me. She was concerned about my well-being, while standing next to a man who had just betrayed her trust in the most fundamental way possible. I looked into her trusting eyes, then at Thomas's guilty expression, then toward Amanda, who was clearly struggling with her own internal torment. I began, then stopped. The entire congregation was watching me now, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Rebecca's parents looked confused and concerned. The photographer had lowered her camera, and even the wedding planner had stopped whispering into her headset. In that moment, I realized I was facing a choice that would define not only the rest of the ceremony, but possibly the rest of my career as a minister. I could complete the wedding and live with the knowledge of what I had seen, or I could take a stand for the truth, even if it meant destroying what appeared to be the perfect wedding day. The silence stretched on, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool October air. Rebecca was looking at me with increasing concern, while Thomas seemed to be holding his breath, perhaps wondering if I had somehow discovered his secret. Finally, I made my decision. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence that had fallen over the church, "I need to ask for everyone's patience for just a moment." I could feel the collective intake of breath from the congregation. Rebecca's eyes widened with concern, while Thomas went pale. I had never stopped a ceremony like this before, but I knew I couldn't proceed without addressing what I had witnessed. "Rebecca, Thomas, I need to speak with both of you privately for just a moment," I continued, trying to keep my voice steady and calm. Perhaps the wedding party could take a brief recess. The murmur from the guests grew louder. Rebecca's mother, Catherine Martinez, half rose from her seat in the front pew. "Father, what's happening?" she called out, her voice tight with worry. "Please, everyone remain calm," I said, raising my hand gently. "This will just take a few minutes." I led Rebecca and Thomas to a small alcove beside the altar, partially hidden from the congregation by a decorative screen. Rebecca was clearly distressed, her hands shaking as she gripped her bouquet. "What's going on?" she whispered urgently. "Why did you stop the ceremony?" I looked at Thomas, giving him one last chance to tell the truth himself. "Thomas, is there anything you need to share with Rebecca before we continue?" His face went through a series of expressions: panic, guilt, defiance, and finally resignation. He looked at Rebecca, then back at me, and I could see the internal battle playing out in his features. I don't know what you mean," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Thomas," I said quietly, "I saw Amanda leaving your preparation room just before the ceremony began. She was clearly distressed, and you emerged looking disheveled. Rebecca deserves to know the truth before she commits her life to you." The name Amanda hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her face went white, and she took a step backward. "Amanda? Amanda Foster from your office." Her voice was barely a whisper. Thomas closed his eyes, and I watched as the last of his defenses crumbled. "Rebecca, it wasn't supposed to happen. It was just, we were talking, and she was telling me she couldn't watch me marry someone else, and—" "Oh my God," Rebecca breathed, her bouquet falling from her hands as she pressed her palms against her face. "Oh my God, Thomas, tell me you didn't—" "Not today, not on our wedding day." The truth came pouring out then, like water through a broken dam. Thomas had been having an affair with Amanda for months. She had come to the church that morning to make one final plea for him to call off the wedding, and in the emotional intensity of the moment, they had, well, the rest was obvious. Rebecca's sobs could be heard by the guests despite our attempts at privacy. Her sister Lisa rushed over, having sensed a crisis from her position with the bridesmaids. Within moments, both families were involved, and the beautiful wedding ceremony had devolved into a scene of heartbreak and betrayal. "How could you do this to me?" Rebecca cried, her makeup running in dark streams down her cheeks. "Today, on our wedding day, in God's house." Thomas tried to reach for her, but she pulled away violently. "Don't touch me. Don't you ever touch me again." As word of what had happened spread through the congregation, Amanda, who had been watching from the back of the church, finally stepped forward. Her face was streaked with tears as she approached our small group. "I'm so sorry, Rebecca," she said, her voice breaking. "This is all my fault. I should never have come here today. I should never have. I tried to tell him he should tell you the truth months ago, but I was weak, and I—" "Get out," Rebecca said quietly, her voice deadly calm despite her tears. "Both of you, get out of my sight." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Rebecca, supported by her family and friends, walked out of the church with her head held high, leaving her wedding dress train trailing behind her like a symbol of broken dreams. Thomas stood alone at the altar, abandoned by his groomsmen, and facing the judgment of 200 shocked witnesses. As the guests filed out in stunned silence, I remained in the empty church, still wearing my ceremonial vestments, processing what had just occurred. In 20 years of ministry, I had never experienced anything quite like this. The decision to stop the ceremony had been the hardest of my career, but as I knelt before the altar later that evening, I knew I had done the right thing. 6 months later, I received a letter from Rebecca. She had moved to San Francisco and started a new job with a nonprofit organization. She thanked me for having the courage to stop the ceremony, saving her from what would have been a marriage built on lies and betrayal. She was in therapy, she wrote, working to the pain and learning to trust again. "You gave me the truth when I needed it most," she wrote in her elegant handwriting. Even though it hurt more than I can describe, it set me free to find something real. As I folded her letter and placed it in my desk drawer, I reflected on the complex nature of truth and love, and how sometimes the most loving thing you can do is speak a painful truth. The perfect wedding day had become something entirely different, but perhaps, in its own way, it had become something more important, a moment when truth triumphed over deception, when integrity mattered more than appearances. Rebecca's wedding day had ended in heartbreak, but it had also given her the chance to start over with honesty and hope. And sometimes, that's the most sacred ceremony of all.